Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 12th of September, and in today's update, we're looking at three critical junctures along the front line. I will begin with Kupyansk, where the Russians are now using gas pipelines to infiltrate the Ukrainian rear and send forces through a more secure route to the front line. We'll look at the full extent of the story in the way in which it is currently affecting the battlefield in the northern chunks of Kupyansk. We'll then focus on yet another Russian advance, this time to the east of the Kazani River, and we'll give a clarification on what's going on in the Kocherov Yar pockets. We'll then finish off with the Nepro oblast front, wherein the Russians have captured yet another village. This time it's Chernove, and this was done by the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade. So as I zoom in over here on Kupyansk, please like, subscribe, comment, just do anything to help boost us in the algorithm. I greatly appreciate it. And you can see over here on the map that I've demarcated the pipeline route used by the Russians. So they entered into the gas pipeline around here to the northeast of Liman Pershi and north of Vilshana. They were able to tap into a particular underground access point at this location. And then they traveled roughly 14 kilometers when you look at the sequence of movement over here, including crossing under the Oskil River and then across the western bank of the river. And they left at one particular opening, and it's rather small, but there is an opening that was recorded by Deep State, and this video is from September 12th, of course. It shows two Russian soldiers exiting the pipeline, and one of them got out first and helped pull out the other one. So there has clearly been a transfer of forces via this route, and as a result, the casualties for the Russian forces that are initially stationed near some of the populated areas like Sinkivka or in this forested area directly to the east of the Oskar River, their movement across to the western bank has not necessarily been the most dangerous because they've had this opportunity to evade any Ukrainian reconnaissance or any sort of harassment via FPV strikes due to them being underground. So it took 4 days, according to Ukrainian sources, for like the average Russian soldier to get from the starting point to the ending point. So that 4-day journey naturally does lead to constraints when it comes to the pace of operations and logistics, which is why the Russians did use electronic scooters and probably still do to move from one place to another within the pipeline. So the radius is large enough that it permits the utilization of an electric scooter and also stretchers within the tunnel. And there were also accommodations set up for sleeping because naturally over a 4-day journey, there has to be a degree of sleep. And there were just a constant, steady supply. And I don't know why I'm using past tense. This is still happening. They have a steady stream of supplies and food rationing that goes through this area. I'd assume there's also some sort of oxygen tank that they are utilizing because when we look back at history at previous Russian engagements using gas pipelines, for instance, around Suja, they also did have a lot of these oxygen tanks and gas masks that they would put on. So the journey, as I said before, takes 4 days, and using this route, some of the Russian UAV operators were able to safely cross over the river and enter into the northern outskirts of Kupyansk. According to Deep State, there are already Russian FPV drone operators that are, I would suppose, within the basements of these houses over here in the areas under Russian control. And from those forward positions, they get a much clearer view and are in much closer proximity to their drones as they engage in targeting and spotting Ukrainian forces within the remaining Ukrainian-controlled chunks of the city. And we have a compilation of Russian FPV strikes that have unfolded in recent days. The FPVs, in this case, targeting a lot of armored vehicles associated with the Ukrainians and some pickup trucks and resident or private civilian vehicles used by the Ukrainians as well. So a lot of them just being picked off as they enter into the city, as they move through the industrial zone in the eastern part of the city. And some of them do have these sort of cope cage-esque formation around them. And this is something that I've also noticed to a certain degree with some of the Russian vehicles, especially the lighter ones. They can afford to build a cage that covers up the entirety of the vehicle, spanning from the bottom to the top, including the region around the tires. And so That's obviously going to be bulky, but it is a way to, at least to a certain degree, absorb the damage caused by a lower yield FPV drone. But again, after two, three, four, five strikes, you could imagine that even that would not be sufficient, given the fact that the material isn't necessarily the most stubborn and steadfast. In any case, though, those drone operators are going to have an easier time because they are operating and flying the drones at such close proximity to their actual physical location, which would be in basements, and mainly in residential areas, just like private one-story houses and not apartment buildings. The apartment buildings are a bit deeper into the city, near the downtown region of Western Kupyansk, and the Ukrainians are, of course, taking advantage of that. They're trying to, I suppose, remain in the basements during the periods where they're not engaged in active fighting and seeking refuge over there amidst Russian fab strikes on this area, or just broad ranging MLRS fire. And for that reason, they're able to reduce their amount of casualties and then in turn use the apartments to fire upon any advancing Russian forces. I suppose they would also have their own drone crews operating perhaps on the eastern bank of the river or in southern Kupyansk for similar purposes of picking off advancing Russian soldiers. And they would have much more success with that if the Russians did not have access to the gas pipeline, because then you'd have a scenario wherein all of the forces from, say, the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade or the 68th Motor Rifle Division and the various subunits within that division, or perhaps all of these other new units that were created to engage with the Oscar River bridgehead, like 350th Motor Rifle Brigade. And there's a whole host of these new units created between 2023 and 24 that are also working in tandem with the 27th Brigade in this particular case. So imagine if they all had to cross through the river, which is a natural barrier. It's difficult in this particular area where the Russians did cross over, at least physically, like on surface level. It is a bit less difficult because the river is rather narrow over here. So, you could use a raft, you could use a wooden plank even to cross over, or you could just trust your own abilities and swim and, get wet. But all of those are possibilities. It does slow down the logistics to a certain degree, and that's why drone crews are important as well, because they can drop supplies, not ubiquitously. It's not going to be just some silver bullets that can fix all the logistics issues, but it can help specific particular groups whenever they are in urgent need of a resupply, as we saw with the Kucherov Yar and Zolty Kolodyaz pockets and salients. But in any case, that's a bit more on how the Russians are just trying to increase their presence on the western bank over here. And that was the entire goal from the beginning when the Russians pursued this river crossing. They sensed that it was certainly possible to cross over the river, that it was pretty narrow over here, and that they can actually have a streamlined approach to resupplying it. And now the gas pipeline only further benefits that and abets in that mission. And now, of course, the Russians are already at the northern outskirts. Some recent reports allege that they are also making inroads along the eastern industrial zone and near the armory, near some of the industrial facilities as well, near Kucherivka or a bit closer to the Oska River itself. Again, unverified, but due to the fact that the Ukrainians are splitting their attention between areas like the Western Bank, where there are already house-to-house clashes going on, or in Moskovka, where you have forces that left Radkivka or left the entrance to the gas pipeline, and then from there were able to approach the rail station in Moskovka and turn that into a forward frontline base of operation. And of course, the Ukrainians have to respond to that and send in infantry squads and companies to drag out the fighting, largely from 114th TDF Brigade. The 116th Mechanized Brigade is also involved, and their logo is over here, but they are also fighting in the city of Kupyansk, and the 14th Mechanized Brigade. Those are the three units that were mentioned by Russian FPV drone teams when it came to alleging that, okay, they destroyed so-and-so equipment, and they referenced those particular units. So that should give us a good idea of the forces that are actually involved in the course of the urban battle. Now, zooming southwards, I do want to look at what's going on near the Kazani Tourette's River, because we do have this solid river line, which, based on the geometry of the front line over here, does appear to be in danger. It certainly does. The Ukrainians are aware of this, which is why they've doubled down on their buildup over here of forces, sending in a lot of reinforcements, especially throughout August, especially early August, And even since then, they've redeployed additional forces. Most recently, the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. The 4th Brigade was the final tank brigade, but it was finally converted to a heavy mechanized unit, meaning that it was stripped of, I believe, one of its tank battalions, which will be, if it hasn't already, been redistributed to another heavy mechanized brigade. So they're trying to just spread out the tank assets across a broader part of the front line, so there is more universal access to them for each part of the front. Each sector needs, of course, a certain degree of auxiliary support via tanks whenever the context would provide for such a need, I would say. Over here, the Russians were able to capture 1.9 square kilometers of territory just to the southeast of Sofivka. There's a video over here from September 10th of the 4th Heavy Mechanized Brigade conducting grenade drops, dropping grenades onto Ukrainian fortifications. So these defense lines, we could see based on the footage that they contain the Dragon's Teeth to absorb the initial shock of a mechanized attack. There's an anti-tank ditch and trenches, but there weren't like a fully completed barbed wirings over here, which is a bit of a deficiency compared to some of the other fortifications built a bit to the north. So, for instance, some of the defenses built, I would say, from the border between Nepro and Donetsk over here. You could see that. I'm just going to hover over it over here with an X. And then from there, branching out north of Dobropilia, south of Belozersk, they are much more fleshed out when it comes to their structure and intricacies. And I would say that's a consequence of the fact that they are farther away from the front line, meaning that there has been a longer period of time where the Ukrainians could work over there without being targeted on a daily basis and being disincentivized from even attempting to, build or use any sort of excavators or larger engineering equipment, or out in the open continue digging trenches, for instance. So those sort of activities cannot be replicated in an area that's at ground zero of the line of contact naturally. So those defenses that right now the Russians are infiltrating, they were built a bit later on, although just due to the fact that it is located southwards, the Ukrainians did start building some of the trenches over here a bit earlier, but they weren't able to complete them due to the Russians obviously arriving before they were able to actualize their fully fleshed out plan for the defensive framework and layouts in this particular location. But because they sensed that the Russians were approaching, then logically they would have to begin working over here first and foremost in order to prevent the Russians from overrunning it at a future point in time. So it goes both ways in terms of the, I suppose, timeline for which defenses were built first and what was the logic behind doing it in such a manner. But in any case, there were defenses over here, and within a certain context, it could be considered formidable, but you actually have to have manpower that can hold on to it and repel any sort of incoming threats. Now, this is not to say that the Ukrainians lack manpower over here. They don't. They certainly have the necessary amount of forces, but the question is whether they can retain control over an open area that does, of course, contain fortifications, but is a bit farther to the west or to the east from the most solid Ukrainian positions, which would be the basements in Toretsk, in Sofivka, in Shachove, in Volodymyrivka. The surefire way to avoid being struck by the Russian side, especially now with their FAB campaign, would be to remain in basements. And when you have a trench over here that, of course, has its opening and may be not complete to its fullest degree, those are the exact locations that the Russian Air Force is looking to strike. So there has been a decrease, admittedly, when it comes to the degree of FAB strikes over the past 3 weeks. It's been gradually going down, and I believe it's a consequence of the fact that there is a slight operational pause over here. Maybe not even slight. It's actually, very out there and very well known that the pace of operations has gone down, not just in terms of ground clashes, but also in terms of the Russian artillery outputs and FAB strikes, because you can analyze that based on the amount of new craters that you see on Sentinel imagery. There's been less and less as time goes on, but there still is some of it, and the ones that we do see, the new craters appearing, largely tend to be concentrated around the Kazani Terets River, and also some of them around Zloty Kolodyaz, but that's to a lesser degree. We're seeing a lot of FAB footage of strikes on Volodymyrivka, as it appears that some of the positions over here, the Russians would like to prevent the Ukrainians from really fully meshing themselves into. They really would like to dislodge the Ukrainians from their positions within this salient, because having this very strong Ukrainian valve in this particular location, it sort of stymies the connectivity of the Russian front line. They would, of course, like to have full streamlined connectivity between Rusin Yar all the way up to Kocherov Yar, and then from there advance along paved roads and along the river line itself to various other villages that are upstream from there. So that's a consideration as well, and it's why the Russians are now shifting their focus and putting more efforts into advancing from Poltavka northwestwards, because they've sensed an opportunity over here to seize all of the heights and some of the fortified areas that are overlooking the villages within the Terets River line. You can see over here, this is the extent of the heights, and for the most part, they are falling into Russian hands. Some of the key ones directly north of Poltavka have already been taken over and have been solidified as forward operating nodes for the Russian side, perhaps even mortar crews getting closer, and certainly drone crews approaching this area and starting to inflict damage to the Ukrainian side. So again, the Ukrainian drone crews are also very active. Like we said, the 4th Heavy Mechanized Brigade deployed in this area, in addition to the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, Corps National Police Detachment, 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, 93rd Mechanized, Mechanized, 157th Mechanized. The list goes on. There's so many of them in this particular area. We don't have to rehash them every single time. But that means there is actually a certain density to the Ukrainian force disposition over here, which means that they can't afford to dispatch some forces a bit to the east to hold on to certain pockets that are in exposed positions, but they do drag out the fighting and distract the Russians from their main objective of squeezing the Ukrainians out of this pocket over here that's forming. So that's why we have seen the Ukrainians first and foremost stabilize the front line, ensuring that the river line does not fall in an immediate fashion in a rapid manner. And as a result, they've been able to largely retain the structure of the 73 square kilometers in which they still reside. But the Russians are capitalizing on certain gaps in open areas, along routes like ravines, and certain weak points in trenches where the Ukrainians are not situated, and have captured 1.9 square kilometers. So that's an advance amounting to, let's see over here, about 3 or 2.8 kilometers going westwards, with the intention of having this strong prong that will really put a massive hindrance on further resupply efforts for the Ukrainians, not only in an area like Sofivka, which is a bit to the north, but particularly for an area like Volodymyrivka, which is so deep within the Russian zone of operations and influence. It's not under their control, but it's just surrounded and enveloped by Russian-held positions, which makes it an extremely difficult village to hold on to. But that's why it's, the Ukrainians are doubling down on it with investment via more infantry. And that's a part of the consequence of why the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to it for so long. All in all, the pace of operations, as we've said before, is very low. It's been reduced significantly over the past 2 to 3 weeks. And I believe this is a consequence of the fact that we're seeing a redeployment of Russian forces. Some of the elements of the 51st Combined Arms Army are being withdrawn to the rear. Others are being deployed as before they were reserves, or they were operating on another part of the front line. Now they're being sent over here to replenish the existing forces. And then you have the Marine units that are being integrated to the front line. And I would expect that it could take them another week or two until they fully are integrated into the sort of setup for the front line over here and begin getting tasks to actually conduct new offensive activities. Because everybody's looking at the buildup of Russian forces of 12,000, 15,000 Marines perhaps around the city of Donetsk and around the city of Bakhmut as well. And there is a anticipation that they will eventually accumulate and then be used for future potential offensive activities, and that will affect the course of the Pokrovsk direction, the Dobropilya direction, and even from an area like Rusin Yar directly northwards. We've looked at it in the past. There are also possibilities from there, which we'll explore in later videos. Now, to finish off with Nepro Oblast, we can see over here that 18.4 square kilometers of territory have been captured within the past 24 hours. The final pocket of resistance in this northwestern corner of Donetsk, and I shouldn't say northwestern within all of Donetsk, just this particular corner was within sort of the northwestern parts of the front line for a while over here in the Komishivaka direction. But the Ukrainians, nonetheless, they held on to their positions in tree lines and in some trenches that are set around the perimeter of this corner-shaped position. Now it's been fully taken over, and as a result, a new salient is formed, one that spans from the area south of Sosnivka to Berezhove. So the Russians have already been able to seize the initiative and take over the village of Ternove, which was in a rather precarious position because it is within this same salient. And it's rather small in surface area. So again, once the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade, which already has a lot of momentum, was able to set their foot in there, the momentum was on their side even further, and they had the ability to just seize the entirety of the village and raise their flag over here. They were also present to the south over here. So that's undeniable at this point based on video footage. But according to Deep State, so this is something that's not been recorded, but this is something they're alleging, the Russian forces have already been able to move past Ternove, which will be important because it serves as this sort of linchpin within Nepro oblast that can be used to project power and advance along the same line of villages westwards. And we're already seeing that manifest in reality with the Russian forces operating north and east of Berezhove. So they've advanced along Volitsia Centralna Central Road over here. You can see that route over here with the arrows. And directly to the north, there are harassment campaigns going on, which have the intention of distracting the Ukrainian forces, pinning them down in undesired locations, such that the frontal assault can also be successful. And then from two approaches, there can be a closing in on the entirety of the populated area to force the Ukrainians out to withdraw to not even Novomykolaivka, because that village is in the process of being taken over as well, but perhaps an area like Kalanivska, which is protected by the trenches. But there's a huge concern about the fact that they may not be properly manned at this point, that due to the fact that we're looking at a really expansive part of the front line and not a sufficient amount of Ukrainian forces, they really are lacking when it comes to quality and quantity. I'll continue reiterating that. I talked about it on Twitter and I talked about it in the video yesterday, but there seriously has to be more Ukrainian impetus from the high command to redirect forces. So you try to think about which location could be downscaled at this point in time. I suppose Sumy would be a good option, not too much, because at that point, the Russians will also find some sort of gap over there, as they do with every part of the front line that's stripped of its core units. But perhaps a brigade or two from Sumy. You look at certain areas in Kherson, perhaps, that can be used to strip down. But we're reaching the point where there has to be a subsistence level amount of forces everywhere along the front line. There can't be a sector where the line of contact is only defended by drone crews and by barely any infantry, and just really poor infantry for that matter. So even in Kherson, where it's not a location that is ripe for advances, there does have to be a surface level amount of deployment, and that's always going to be the case, even in times of crisis like this, where, for instance, the Russians continue advancing on a daily basis and taking over village after village, and reinforcements are urgently needed. But in Kherson, the units have already largely been redirected to other critical parts of the front line, but there are still gaping holes elsewhere, and those have not been addressed over here, for instance. So this is, for instance, something that the Ukrainians can think about, redirecting forces from the Vavcha River front, I suppose the border region between Dnipro and Donetsk over here, that's a bit to the north, because there is a large concentration of Ukrainian forces. And it wouldn't be the largest loss in the world to cede control of Zeleniha, Andrivka, Klasove in a staggered manner, and then withdraw to bases in Havrlivka and Ivanivka. That would be the trade-off of reducing Ukraine's footprint over here and then redirecting some of those forces southwards to help stabilize the front line near Chernovo and Berezhove. So that would be a practical step that can be taken by the Ukrainians, and it would also reduce the amount of chaos, because you're looking at a diversion of forces of about 20 kilometers, so it's not too far away, and it could be done in a rather fast manner. And on the topic of counterattacks, actually, we have this video over here from the Skala Regiment. The Skala Assault Regiment has been very active across every single outstretched Russian location that can present a threat in the future if consolidated upon. They have also released this footage of their recapturing of Filia. Filia being this minor hamlet to the north of the Vavcha River in the direction of Novopavlivka. It was taken over by Russian forces that swam across the river and raised their flag. Now the flag has been lowered and a Ukrainian one has been placed in its stead. So this Scala unit has been consistently redeployed, and at this point I've come to the conclusion that they are larger than a regiment. They're probably even brigade sized. You look at it according to militaryland.net, they have 6 battalions, and we have public information about, I believe, 4 of them. But when you look at that in its actuality, it's actually a brigade sized formation. So it's not fully cohesive, it's not unified in terms of its deployment. Some of the battalions are operating along one sector and others in another, and they're also very fluid. They can be moved very quickly and act as a rapid reaction force to stop the leakages and to reverse Russian gains in real time. So that's what was done near the border between Russia and Kharkiv. This was even to the north of the Outskirts riverfront. There was just another Russian approach and another crossing of the border, which was threatening. And so the Scala was sent over there. It was sent to Udachny. It was sent to the city of Pokrovsk. It was sent to the area to the east of Mirnorod. It was sent to, of course, the village of Zarichny, which is to the west of the Zherbets River. And now we're seeing it here in Filia, retaking that village. So it must be the case that the battalions are split and are conducting these activities at the same time in parallel, but not together. And so that's all I have for today. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.